Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through the quiet corridors of ancient history. Tonight, we're trading the familiar comforts of modern travel for something far more challenging. Whether you're settling in for the night or just looking to slow down after a long day, I'm glad you're here with me. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. What city, what country, and what time is it as you press play? There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all drifting through these ancient stories together, scattered across time zones, but united in curiosity. If this kind of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to subscribe. We have many more tales from the dusty roads of antiquity waiting for us. Now, let's set the scene, shall we? Picture this. You're planning a vacation. Maybe you're thinking about that Mediterranean cruise, or perhaps a nice flight to visit family across the country. You're worried about delayed flights, lost luggage, maybe whether the hotel Wi-Fi will work properly. You complain about cramped airline seats, overpriced airport food, and the inconvenience of security lines. But imagine if your biggest travel concern wasn't whether your phone charger would work in a foreign country, but whether you'd survive the journey at all. Imagine if a simple trip to see relatives 3 towns over required weeks of preparation, armed escorts, and a genuine possibility that you might never return home. Imagine if the very act of leaving your village meant facing bandits, wild animals, disease, exposure to the elements, and terrain so treacherous that a wrong turn could mean death for you and everyone traveling with you. Welcome to travel in biblical times, where every journey was an odyssey, every road a potential battlefield, and every stranger a question mark between salvation and doom. Over the next several parts, we're going to explore exactly why traveling in the ancient world was less like a relaxing getaway and more like volunteering for a particularly dangerous military expedition. We'll discover how a simple business trip could take months to complete, why traveling alone was essentially a suicide mission, and how the roads themselves were often more dangerous than the destinations. We'll explore the fascinating world of ancient hospitality laws, the grim realities of ancient inns, and why most people never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite all these overwhelming obstacles, people did travel. Merchants crossed deserts, pilgrims journeyed to holy sites, families moved between cities, and news somehow spread across vast distances. The human spirit, it seems, has always been willing to risk everything for connection, commerce, and the simple desire to see what lies beyond the next hill. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's walk together down those ancient paths where every step was a gamble, and every sunset brought both relief and the promise of new dangers ahead. Because in biblical times, travel wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about survival. Let's begin with the most fundamental challenge of ancient travel, the roads themselves, or rather, the lack of them. When we think of roads today, we imagine smooth asphalt, clear signage, rest stops with clean facilities, and GPS systems that can guide us turn by turn to any destination on Earth. In biblical times, the concept of a road was far more generous than the reality. Most of what passed for roads were actually just well-worn paths, beaten down by centuries of human and animal traffic. These weren't paved, weren't maintained, and certainly weren't marked with helpful signs saying Jerusalem 50 miles or caution bandit territory ahead. They were dirt tracks that turned into muddy quagmires during the rainy season and dust-choked nightmares during droughts. Picture yourself as a merchant in ancient Palestine, planning to transport goods from your village to the markets in Jerusalem. You can't simply load up a wagon and head out in the morning, expecting to arrive by evening. First, you need to study the route, which might involve asking every traveller you meet about current conditions. Has there been rain? Are the wadis flooded? Have there been recent bandit attacks? Is there tribal warfare along the usual path? The terrain itself was your first enemy. The ancient world was carved by geological forces that seemed designed to make human movement as difficult as possible. Steep hills rose without warning, forcing travelers to choose between exhausting climbs or dangerous detours around their bases. Deep valleys and ravines cut across the landscape like scars, requiring lengthy journeys to find safe crossing points. Rivers presented particular challenges. There were no bridges in the modern sense, no ferry services running on schedule. Rivers had to be forded, which meant finding the shallowest crossing points, often far from the direct route. During flood season, a river that was ankle-deep in summer could become a raging torrent that would sweep away entire caravans. And then there was the weather. Without meteorologists or weather forecasts, travelers had to rely on traditional signs and local knowledge to predict conditions. A journey that might take 3 days in good weather could stretch to 2 weeks if storms rolled in. Flash floods could appear without warning in desert regions, turning dry creek beds into deadly torrents. Sandstorms in desert areas could last for days, forcing travelers to hunker down and wait, consuming precious supplies while making no progress toward their destination. The desert regions, which covered much of the biblical landscape, presented their own unique horrors. During the day, temperatures could soar to levels that would kill a modern person in hours. At night, those same deserts could become freezing cold, dropping below temperatures that could cause fatal hypothermia. Water was scarce, precious, and had to be carried in heavy containers that became burdens themselves. Navigation was another nightmare entirely. There were no maps in the modern sense, no detailed guides showing elevation changes, water sources, or safe camping spots. Travelers relied on oral traditions, passed down stories of landmarks and hazards. Follow the ridge until you see the twin rocks, then head toward the setting sun until you reach the dry riverbed. Then, these directions were only as good as the memory of the person giving them, and landscapes change over time. Earthquakes could alter familiar landmarks overnight. Erosion could wash away crucial reference points. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it was often fatal. In desert regions, wandering off the established routes meant facing death by dehydration, exposure, or starvation. In mountainous areas, a wrong turn could lead to impassable cliffs or treacherous slopes. Even in more populated regions, losing the path could mean stumbling into hostile territory or areas controlled by bandits. The few established routes that did exist were jealously controlled and heavily taxed. The famous trade routes, like those connecting Egypt to Mesopotamia, were valuable precisely because they offered some measure of safety and reliability. But using these routes meant paying tribute to every local ruler, customs official, and protection racket along the way. A merchant might find his profits consumed entirely by the various taxes, bribes, and protection fees required just to move his goods from one city to another. Even when you found a decent path, the physical act of travel was exhausting beyond modern comprehension. Most people walked everywhere. Horses were expensive and required constant care and feeding. Donkeys were more practical, but still represented a significant investment. Camels were ideal for desert travel, but were specialized animals that required expert knowledge to manage properly. Walking 20 miles in a day was considered excellent progress. More often, travelers might cover only 10 to 15 miles, depending on terrain and weather conditions. This meant that journeys we could complete in hours today took weeks or even months. A trip from Jerusalem to Babylon, roughly 500 miles as the crow flies, could easily take 2 months of hard travel under good conditions. The physical toll was severe. Without proper footwear, travelers' feet would become bloody and infected. The constant exposure to sun, wind, and weather aged people rapidly. Malnutrition was common on long journeys, as carrying enough food was often impossible. Water, when available, was frequently contaminated, leading to dysentery and other diseases that could kill or permanently disable travelers. And we haven't even discussed the human dangers yet. The roads, such as they were were hunting grounds for bandits, raiders, and desperate people who saw travelers as opportunities rather than fellow human beings. Every hill could hide an ambush. Every narrow pass could become a trap. Every stranger encountered could be the last person a traveler ever saw. The famous parable of the Good Samaritan takes on new meaning when you understand the reality of ancient travel. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notorious for bandit attacks, precisely because it was a necessary route with limited alternatives. Travelers had to use it, which made them predictable targets. The fact that the beaten man in the story was stripped and left for dead wasn't unusual. It was standard operating procedure for ancient highway robbery. Local conflicts added another layer of danger. Tribal disputes, territorial wars, and political upheavals could make entire regions impassable overnight. A route that was safe on Tuesday could become a battlefield by Thursday, with travelers caught in the middle. Unlike modern conflicts, which often have clearly defined combatants and rules of engagement, ancient warfare was chaotic and unpredictable. Soldiers, mercenaries, and armed groups moved across the landscape like storms, bringing violence to anyone in their path. Religious and ethnic tensions added yet more complexity. Certain groups couldn't safely travel through territories controlled by their enemies. Jews couldn't safely travel through some Samaritan areas, and vice versa. Gentiles might find themselves unwelcome in strictly observant communities. These social boundaries weren't marked on any map, but crossing them could mean imprisonment, slavery, or death. Even when travelers managed to avoid human threats, the landscape itself was filled with dangers that would terrify modern people. Wild animals weren't just a theoretical concern, they were a daily reality. Lions still roamed parts of the Middle East during biblical times. Bears inhabited mountainous regions. Wolves, hyenas, and other predators saw humans as potential prey, especially at night, or when travelers were alone or injured. Venomous snakes and scorpions were constant threats, particularly in desert regions. A single bite or sting could kill a healthy adult within hours, and there were no antivenoms, no emergency medical services, no way to get help quickly. Travelers learned to check their bedrolls carefully, to watch where they stepped, and to pray that they wouldn't be the unlucky ones. Disease was perhaps the most insidious enemy of all. Ancient travelers had no understanding of germs, sanitation, or proper hygiene. They drank from whatever water sources they could find, often sharing them with animals and other travelers. They ate food that had no refrigeration, no preservatives, and no quality control. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases could strike without warning, leaving travelers weak, dehydrated, and vulnerable to other dangers. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences today could become death sentences on ancient roads. A sprained ankle could slow a traveler down enough to make them easy prey for bandits. A small cut could become infected and develop into life-threatening sepsis. A broken bone could leave someone unable to continue their journey, forcing them to depend on the charity of strangers or face death by exposure. The psychological toll of ancient travel was enormous. Modern travelers might experience some anxiety about flights or unfamiliar places, but ancient travelers lived with the constant knowledge that each day might be their last. They left home knowing there was a significant chance they would never return. They said goodbye to families and friends with the understanding that these might be final farewells. This constant stress, combined with the physical hardships of travel, broke many people. Depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues were common among long-distance travelers. Though these conditions weren't understood or treated, many travelers developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder from their experiences on the road. And yet, despite all these overwhelming challenges, people continued to travel. Trade routes remained active, pilgrimages continued, families stayed connected across vast distances. The human desire for connection, commerce, and exploration proved stronger than even the most daunting obstacles. But how did they do it? How did ancient people manage to traverse such dangerous landscapes and survive journeys that would challenge even modern adventurers with all our technology and preparation? The answer lies in a complex system of survival strategies, community support, and sheer determination that we'll explore as our journey continues. The roads of the biblical world weren't just paths between destinations. They were tests of human endurance, courage, and resourcefulness. Every mile covered was a victory against overwhelming odds, every safe arrival a minor miracle worth celebrating. As we settle deeper into our exploration of ancient travel, remember that the stories we're uncovering aren't just historical curiosities. They're testimonies to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, reminders of how far we've come, and perhaps most importantly, evidence that even in the most challenging circumstances, people found ways to reach each other across the vast and dangerous world. As the sun began to set on our ancient travelers' first day on the road, a new set of terrors emerged from the gathering darkness. You see, nightfall in the biblical world wasn't simply an inconvenience requiring flashlights and perhaps a roadside motel. It was a transformation of the entire landscape into something far more sinister, where every shadow could conceal death and every sound might herald your doom. Darkness fell quickly in those latitudes, without the gentle twilight that modern travelers might enjoy. One moment there was enough light to see the path ahead, and the next, the world disappeared into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow everything. There were no streetlights, no illuminated signs, no headlights cutting through the gloom. The only light came from whatever fires travelers could manage to build and maintain, creating tiny islands of flickering warmth in an ocean of threatening shadow. Picture yourself as that same merchant we mentioned earlier, now several hours into your journey toward Jerusalem. The path that seemed manageable in daylight has become a treacherous maze of unseen obstacles. Rocks that were easy to step around in the morning now become ankle-breaking hazards hidden in the darkness. Holes and ruts in the path, clearly visible by day, now wait like traps to send you tumbling face first into the dirt or worse, over the edge of an unseen cliff. The sounds of night were particularly unnerving for ancient travelers. Every rustle in nearby bushes could be a wild animal sizing up its next meal. Every footstep echo could belong to bandits moving into position for an ambush. The howling of wolves, the roar of lions, the scream of hunting cats, all these sounds carried clearly through the still night air, reminding travelers that they were not alone and certainly not safe. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the silence. Long stretches of absolute quiet, broken only by the travelers' own footsteps and breathing, could be more frightening than any threatening noise. In that silence, imagination ran wild. Was someone following just out of earshot? Were eyes watching from the darkness? Had the entire world simply vanished, leaving the traveler alone in an endless void? Sleep, when it was possible at all, was a luxury fraught with danger. Ancient travelers couldn't simply pull over at a rest stop or check into a roadside inn. Safe sleeping spots were rare and precious, usually consisting of caves, rocky overhangs, or defensible positions that offered some protection from both weather and predators. Even then, someone had to stay awake to keep watch, feeding the fire and listening for threats. In groups, travelers took turns at guard duty, but solo travelers faced the impossible choice between exhaustion and vigilance. The fire itself was both salvation and beacon. Without it, travelers risked freezing to death in desert climates, where temperatures could drop 40 degrees or more after sunset. The fire kept wild animals at bay, provided light for essential tasks, and offered psychological comfort in the terrifying darkness. But that same fire also announced the traveler's location to anyone or anything within miles. Bandits used distant fires to locate potential victims, Hostile tribes could spot travelers from great distances. The very thing that kept you alive could also get you killed. Food and water presented their own nightmarish challenges during overnight stops. Without refrigeration or preservatives, food spoiled quickly in hot climates. Travelers had to carefully ration supplies, never knowing if they would find more along the route. Water was even more critical and problematic. It was heavy to carry, difficult to keep clean, and absolutely essential for survival. A contaminated water source could kill you just as surely as a bandit's sword, but more slowly and painfully. Many travelers developed severe stomach ailments from drinking whatever water they could find. Springs and wells were often contaminated by animal waste or human activity upstream. Stagnant pools bred disease-causing organisms that ancient people had no way to understand or combat. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses could leave travelers weak, dehydrated, and vulnerable to other dangers. Death by disease was often slower than death by violence, but no less certain. The morning brought its own unique set of challenges. Travelers who had survived the night often woke to find their supplies disturbed by animals, their fires cold, and their bodies stiff and sore from sleeping on hard ground. The psychological toll of spending night after night in constant fear began to accumulate. Many travelers developed what we might now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, becoming increasingly paranoid and jumpy with each passing day on the road. Weather added another layer of complexity to the already dangerous equation of ancient travel. Storms could appear without warning, turning manageable paths into torrents of mud or sheets of ice. Rain might seem like a blessing in hot climates, but it could make roads impassable for days or weeks. Flash floods were particularly deadly in desert regions, where dry riverbeds could become raging torrents in minutes, sweeping away entire caravans without warning. Heat was a constant enemy in many biblical lands. During summer months, daytime temperatures could reach levels that would kill modern people in hours. Ancient travelers had no air conditioning, no cooling systems, no way to escape the relentless sun except to find whatever shade was available. Heat stroke, dehydration, and heat exhaustion claimed countless lives on ancient roads. Travelers learned to move during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, but this meant traveling in low light conditions with reduced visibility and increased risk of accidents. Winter brought different but equally deadly challenges. Cold could kill just as effectively as heat, and ancient travelers had limited protection against freezing temperatures. Clothing was basic, often inadequate for extreme weather. Hypothermia was common, and frostbite could claim fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Snow and ice made already dangerous paths nearly impassable, while winter storms could trap travelers for days or weeks in exposed locations. The sheer physical demands of ancient travel would challenge even modern athletes. Walking 20 miles a day while carrying heavy packs over rough terrain was normal, not exceptional. Travelers' feet became bloody and infected. Their backs ached from carrying supplies. Their joints swelled from constant use. Malnutrition was common, as carrying enough food for long journeys was often impossible. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences today could become death sentences on ancient roads. A twisted ankle could slow a traveler down enough to make them easy prey for bandits or wild animals. A cut that became infected could lead to blood poisoning and death. There were no emergency services, no hospitals, no way to get help quickly when things went wrong. The isolation was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of ancient travel. Travelers could go days or weeks without seeing another human being. When they did encounter other people, there was no way to know if these strangers represented help or danger. Every person met on the road was a gamble, a potential savior, or a potential killer. Language barriers complicated every interaction. The ancient world was a patchwork of different languages, dialects, and cultures. A traveler might speak the language of their destination, but encounter a dozen different tongues along the way. Misunderstandings could escalate into violence quickly when people couldn't communicate effectively. Even simple requests for food or directions could be misinterpreted as threats or insults. Cultural differences added another layer of complexity. What was considered polite behavior in one region might be seen as offensive in another. Religious practices that were sacred to one group might be blasphemous to their neighbors. Travelers had to navigate not just physical obstacles, but complex social and cultural minefields where a wrong word or gesture could have deadly consequences. Women faced additional dangers that male travelers could hardly imagine. Sexual assault was a constant threat, and women traveling alone were seen as easy targets by predators. Even in groups, women were vulnerable to attack, kidnapping, and slavery. Many families simply wouldn't allow women to travel at all, preferring to keep them confined to local areas where male relatives could provide some protection. But children, when they had to travel, were particularly vulnerable to disease, exposure, and violence. They couldn't walk as far or as fast as adults, slowing down entire groups and making everyone more vulnerable to attack. They required more food and water relative to their body weight, straining limited supplies. They were more susceptible to heat, cold, and disease, and they had less immunity to the various illnesses that plagued ancient travelers. The elderly faced their own unique challenges. Age brought wisdom and experience, but also physical limitations that could make travel nearly impossible. Older travelers couldn't walk as far, couldn't carry as much, and were more vulnerable to the elements. Many elderly people simply never traveled, accepting that they would live and die within a small radius of their birthplace. Despite all these overwhelming challenges, trade and travel continued throughout the ancient world. Merchants developed elaborate systems for managing risk, traveling in large, well-armed caravans whenever possible. They established networks of trusted contacts along major routes, creating informal support systems that could provide assistance, information, and emergency aid. Religious pilgrimages continued despite the dangers, driven by faith that was stronger than fear. Pilgrims often traveled in large groups, finding safety in numbers and mutual support. They developed their own traditions and practices for dealing with the hazards of the road, passing down knowledge from generation to generation about safe routes, reliable water sources, and trustworthy way stations. Families found ways to stay connected across vast distances, though it might take months or years to receive word from distant relatives. Letters and messages were carried by professional travelers, merchants, or anyone heading in the right direction. News traveled slowly, and families often had to assume that silence meant the worst. The most successful ancient travelers were those who understood that preparation was everything. They studied routes carefully, gathering intelligence about current conditions. They traveled in groups whenever possible, pooling resources and sharing risks. They carried multiple forms of currency and trade goods, knowing that money or merchandise might be their only ticket to safety in a crisis. They learned to read the signs of weather, danger, and opportunity. They developed networks of contacts and allies along their routes. They mastered the delicate art of negotiation, knowing that the right word or gesture could mean the difference between safe passage and violent death. But even the most prepared, experienced, and cautious travelers knew that survival was never guaranteed. Every journey was a roll of the dice, a bet against overwhelming odds. The fact that anyone survived long-distance travel in the ancient world seems almost miraculous from our modern perspective. And yet they did survive in numbers sufficient to keep trade flowing, families connected, and news spreading across the known world. Their courage, determination, and ingenuity in the face of such overwhelming challenges speaks to something fundamental about human nature, our irrepressible need to explore, connect, and reach beyond the familiar boundaries of home. As we continue our exploration of ancient travel, we'll discover how these brave souls managed to not only survive, but sometimes thrive on the dangerous roads of the biblical world, and how their struggles shaped the very foundations of civilization itself. As dawn broke over our weary ancient traveller, a new day brought with it not relief, but a fresh catalogue of horrors, disguised as everyday necessities. Because you see, surviving the night was only half the battle. Now came the challenge of finding food, water, and shelter in a world where hospitality was both sacred duty and potential death trap. Let's talk about hunger, shall we? In our modern world, we complain when the airplane peanuts are stale or when the hotel breakfast runs out of our preferred cereal. But imagine traveling for days, weeks, or months while carrying every morsel of food on your back. Ancient travelers faced a cruel mathematical equation: carry enough food to survive the journey, but not so much that the weight would slow you down and make you vulnerable to attack. Most food spoiled within hours in hot climates. There was no refrigeration, no preservatives beyond salt and honey, no way to keep meat fresh once it began to rot. Travelers learned to subsist on the most basic provisions: dried bread that could crack teeth, salted meat that had the texture of leather, and whatever fruits or vegetables they could find along the way that hadn't already been claimed by wildlife or other desperate travelers. Water was an even more critical concern. A healthy adult needs roughly 2 liters of water per day under normal conditions. In desert heat, that requirement could double or triple. Water is heavy, roughly 2 pounds per liter, and ancient containers were bulky and prone to leaking. Carrying enough water for a week-long journey meant hauling 40 or 50 pounds of liquid alone, before adding food, clothing, tools, and trade goods. But finding water along the route was often more dangerous than carrying it. Wells and springs were jealously guarded by local communities who saw them as precious resources not to be shared with strangers. Approaching a water source could be seen as an act of aggression, worthy of violent retaliation. Many travelers died fighting over access to wells, or were killed simply for asking permission to drink. Even when water was available, it was frequently contaminated. Ancient people had no understanding of bacteria, parasites, or waterborne diseases. They drank from streams polluted by animal waste, from stagnant pools breeding deadly microorganisms, from wells that had become cesspits for entire communities. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid fever stalked ancient travelers like invisible predators, striking without warning and killing slowly and painfully. The search for food led travelers into their own special kind of nightmare. Hunting required weapons, skill, and time that few travelers possessed. Wild plants and fruits might be edible or might be deadly poison, and there was often no way to tell the difference. Stealing food from farmers or communities was sometimes the only alternative to starvation, but theft could result in immediate execution or worse. Begging for food put travelers at the mercy of strangers who might help or might see a beggar as an opportunity for exploitation. Women begging for food faced the additional threat of sexual assault. Children might be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Even the act of asking for help could be interpreted as a threat by suspicious locals who had learned to fear strangers. This brings us to one of the most complex and dangerous aspects of ancient travel: the institution of hospitality. In the biblical world, hospitality wasn't just good manners, it was a sacred obligation enforced by religious law and social custom. But like everything else in ancient travel, it was fraught with peril for both guest and host. The laws of hospitality required communities to provide food, shelter, and protection to travelers. This wasn't optional charity. It was a binding obligation that could mean the difference between life and death for desperate strangers. But hospitality was also a two-way street that created dangerous obligations and expectations on both sides. A traveler seeking hospitality had to approach strangers and essentially put their life in their hands. There was no way to know if the people offering help were genuine Good Samaritans or predators looking for easy victims. Many bandits and criminals posed as hospitable locals, luring travelers into traps with offers of food and shelter. A warm welcome could quickly turn into robbery, assault, or murder once the traveler let down their guard. Even genuine hospitality carried risks. Accepting food and shelter created obligations that the traveller might not be able to fulfill. In many cultures, guests were expected to provide news, entertainment, or valuable information in exchange for hospitality. A traveller who couldn't meet these expectations might find themselves unwelcome, or even accused of deception. The host family also took enormous risks by welcoming strangers. Travellers might be carrying diseases that could wipe out entire households. They might be criminals, spies, or members of hostile tribes. They might steal valuable possessions or assault family members. The obligation to provide hospitality often conflicted with basic survival instincts. Religious and cultural differences complicated hospitality arrangements even further. Jewish travellers might find themselves unwelcome in Gentile communities, and vice versa. Dietary restrictions, religious observances, and cultural taboos could turn a simple meal into a minefield of potential offences. What was considered polite behaviour in one culture might be deeply insulting in another. Women travellers face particular challenges when seeking hospitality. A woman travelling alone was automatically suspect in many cultures, seen as either immoral or dangerous. Even women travelling in groups might find themselves unwelcome in households that followed strict gender segregation rules. The very act of seeking help could damage a woman's reputation and make her vulnerable to assault or exploitation. The physical accommodations offered by ancient hospitality were far from comfortable by modern standards. Most homes were single-room structures where families, animals, and guests all shared the same space. Privacy was non-existent. Sanitation was primitive at best. Guests might find themselves sleeping on dirt floors, sharing space with livestock, and using outdoor latrines that were breeding grounds for disease. Food offered to guests was often the same basic fare that sustained the host family: bread, olives, perhaps some cheese or dried fruit. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, if it was available at all. Guests were expected to be grateful for whatever was offered, regardless of its quality or their own dietary needs or restrictions. But perhaps most challenging of all was the uncertainty that surrounded every hospitality arrangement. There were no hotels, no standardized accommodations, no reliable way to know what to expect when approaching a stranger's home. Every request for help was a gamble that could result in salvation or doom. Some travelers developed networks of trusted contacts along their regular routes, families or individuals who could be relied upon for safe shelter. But these relationships took years to develop and could be disrupted by death, political changes, or simple misunderstandings. Even trusted allies could become enemies overnight due to shifting political alliances or family feuds. Professional travelers, like merchants and messengers, sometimes established their own informal networks of mutual support. They would leave supplies cached at regular intervals along their routes, or arrange for trusted associates to provide assistance. But these networks were vulnerable to theft, weather damage, and the constant political upheavals that plagued the ancient world. The wealthy could sometimes afford to travel with their own supplies and protection, essentially bringing their own hospitality with them. Large merchant caravans might include servants, guards, cooks, and even portable shelters. But this level of preparation required enormous resources and still offered no guarantee of safety. For the average traveller, every night brought the same terrible choice: seek shelter from strangers and risk betrayal, or sleep in the open and face wild animals, weather, and roving bandits. There were no good options, only degrees of danger that had to be carefully weighed and chosen. The psychological toll of this constant uncertainty was enormous. Travellers developed a kind of paranoid hypervigilance, constantly evaluating threats and escape routes. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest sound, to trust no one completely. Many developed what we would now recognise as severe anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress from their experiences on the road. Children who travelled developed their own unique psychological challenges. They learned early that the world was full of threats, that strangers were dangerous, that safety was temporary and precious. Many never fully recovered from the trauma of early travel experiences, carrying lifelong fears and suspicions that affected their relationships and worldview. The elderly and infirm faced additional challenges when seeking hospitality. They might be seen as burdens, unable to provide useful services in exchange for care. In cultures that viewed age and illness as signs of divine disfavor, elderly travelers might find themselves actively shunned or mistreated. Disease added another layer of complexity to hospitality arrangements. A traveler showing signs of illness might be turned away from every door, left to die alone on the roadside. Even minor symptoms like coughing or fever could mark someone as potentially contagious, making them unwelcome anywhere. In times of plague or epidemic, entire regions might refuse all travelers, creating impassable barriers that could trap people far from home. Weather could turn hospitable communities into desperate competitors for resources. A drought, flood, or crop failure could transform friendly villages into hostile territories where strangers were seen as threats to survival rather than guests to be honored. Natural disasters could eliminate entire networks of support, leaving travelers stranded in suddenly hostile territory. Political upheavals created their own hospitality nightmares. A traveler who was welcome in a region under one ruler might find themselves marked for death when power changed hands. Tribal conflicts, religious wars, and territorial disputes could turn trusted allies into deadly enemies overnight. The obligation to provide hospitality might conflict with newer obligations of loyalty or religious observance. Despite all these dangers and complications, the institution of hospitality persisted throughout the ancient world because it served essential functions that no other system could provide. It allowed trade to continue across vast distances, families to maintain connections despite geographical separation, and ideas to spread between cultures and civilizations. The stories and laws surrounding hospitality in biblical times reflect both its importance and its dangers. The tale of Lot, offering to sacrifice his daughters to protect his guests, shows the extreme lengths to which hospitality obligations could extend. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was partly attributed to their failure to properly welcome strangers. These weren't just moral lessons, they were practical reminders of the life and death importance of treating travelers with respect and care. But as our ancient merchant continues his journey toward Jerusalem, weary from another night of fitful sleep and uncertain hospitality, he knows that the greatest dangers still lie ahead. Because we haven't yet discussed the human predators who made their living from the misery of travelers, the organized criminal networks that turned ancient roads into hunting grounds, and the systematic violence that made every journey a potential death sentence. The bandits are waiting just around the next bend, and they've had all night to prepare their welcome for our unfortunate traveler. The sun climbs higher now, casting harsh shadows across the rocky terrain ahead, and our weary merchant realizes he's approaching the most terrifying part of his journey. Not the wild animals, not the weather, not even the uncertainty of finding food and shelter. No, what awaits him in the narrow passes and hidden valleys ahead are human predators who have turned the ancient roads into their personal hunting grounds. Banditry in biblical times wasn't the romanticized affair of later folklore with honorable thieves who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Ancient bandits were desperate, violent men who saw travelers as walking resources to be harvested like crops. They were often former soldiers, displaced farmers, or outcasts from society who had chosen violence as their means of survival, and they were very, very good at what they did. Picture the perfect bandit territory, a narrow mountain pass where the path winds between high cliffs, offering no alternative routes and limited visibility around each turn. Here, a small group of armed men could control the movement of entire caravans, appearing suddenly from concealed positions to block both advance and retreat. These weren't chance encounters or crimes of opportunity. They were carefully planned military operations, executed by men who knew the terrain intimately. The bandits' favorite tactic was the ambush. They would position themselves at choke points along well-traveled routes, places where geography forced all traffic into predictable patterns. A fallen tree across the path, a deliberately created rock slide, or simply a narrow defile where travelers had to move in single file, all became killing grounds where desperate men waited with crude weapons and murderous intent. Unlike modern criminals who might be content with money and valuables, ancient bandits took everything. They stripped travelers of their clothes, their food, their animals, their trade goods, and often their lives. A successful bandit attack left nothing behind but naked corpses for the vultures and wild dogs. The victims' possessions would be sold in distant markets, their animals used to carry more stolen goods, their weapons distributed among the bandit group. But theft was often just the beginning of a traveler's nightmare. Kidnapping was a lucrative business in the ancient world, where slavery was legal and slave markets operated openly in every major city. A healthy adult could be worth a year's wages to the right buyer. Children were particularly valuable, as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of unpaid labor. Women faced the additional horror of sexual slavery, sold to brothels or private owners who valued them for their bodies rather than their labor. The ransom business was equally terrifying. Bandits would capture travelers and send demands to their families, threatening torture and death unless payment was made. But there was no guarantee that paying the ransom would secure a victim's release. Often, successful ransom payments simply marked a family as wealthy enough to be targeted again. Some bandit groups made their entire living from repeatedly kidnapping members of the same wealthy families. The psychological warfare employed by ancient bandits was particularly cruel. They would leave mutilated bodies along travel routes as warnings to future victims. They would torture captives within earshot of hidden travelers, using their screams to terrorize potential prey. They would force captured travelers to participate in attacks on other victims, breaking down their moral resistance and creating accomplices who could never return to normal society. Some bandit groups grew so large and well organized that they essentially functioned as private armies, controlling entire regions and demanding tribute from anyone who wished to pass through. These criminal kingdoms would establish their own crude legal systems, their own methods of taxation, and their own brutal forms of justice. Travelers entering bandit territory weren't just risking robbery, they were entering a parallel society where violence was the only law and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. The seasonal patterns of banditry made travel planning even more complex. During harvest times, when farmers were busy bringing in crops, bandit activity might decrease as some criminals returned to legitimate work. But during lean seasons, when food was scarce and legal employment unavailable, the roads would swarm with desperate men willing to kill for a day's provisions. Winter months were particularly dangerous, as bandits sought to acquire supplies and shelter for the cold season ahead. Religious festivals and market days created their own unique dangers. Large gatherings of people meant opportunities for both legitimate trade and criminal exploitation. Bandits would infiltrate crowds of pilgrims or merchants, identifying wealthy targets and following them when they departed. The very occasions that brought communities together in celebration also attracted predators who saw crowds as hunting opportunities. The lack of effective law enforcement made bandit activity essentially consequence-free in many regions. Local authorities were often too weak, too corrupt, or too distant to provide meaningful protection to travelers. Even when bandits were captured, they might be recruited by local rulers as soldiers or guards, their criminal skills seen as valuable assets rather than moral failings. Some regions became so infested with bandits that they were essentially abandoned by legitimate travelers. Alternative routes would be developed, even if they were longer and more difficult, simply to avoid areas where attack was virtually guaranteed. But these safer routes would eventually attract their own bandit populations, creating a constant cat-and-mouse game between travelers and criminals. The weapons available to ancient bandits were crude but effective. Bronze and iron swords, spears, clubs, and slings could kill just as efficiently as modern firearms. Arrows were particularly feared because they could strike from concealment at considerable distances. A skilled archer hidden in rocks or trees could pick off travelers one by one, creating panic and confusion that made organized resistance impossible. The bandits' knowledge of local terrain gave them enormous advantages over their victims. They knew every cave, every hidden path, every water source and defensible position. They could appear suddenly, strike quickly, and disappear into landscape that would be impossible for outsiders to navigate. Even large, well-armed groups of travelers could be systematically hunted and destroyed by smaller numbers of bandits who knew how to use the land to their advantage. Communication between bandit groups created networks of criminal intelligence that spanned vast distances. Information about wealthy travelers, valuable cargo, and vulnerable targets would be passed from one criminal organization to another. A merchant who survived an attack in one region might find himself targeted by bandits hundreds of miles away who had received detailed information about his route and resources. The psychological impact of constant bandit threats extended far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities lived in fear of criminal retaliation if they helped travelers or cooperated with authorities. Witnesses to bandit attacks would often flee rather than help victims, knowing that assisting survivors might mark them as targets for future violence. This culture of fear isolated travelers even further, making them dependent on their own resources for survival. Women and children faced additional horrors at the hands of bandits, who saw them not just as sources of wealth, but as objects for personal gratification. The sexual violence that accompanied many bandit attacks was systematic and brutal, designed not just to satisfy criminal desires, but to break the spirits of victims and witnesses. Families traveling together might be forced to watch as their loved ones were assaulted, creating psychological trauma that would last lifetimes for any survivors. The economic impact of banditry rippled through entire societies. Trade routes that became too dangerous would be abandoned, cutting off communities from essential goods and markets. The cost of hiring protection, paying tribute, or taking longer, safer routes would be passed on to consumers, making basic necessities more expensive for everyone. Some regions that depended on trade for survival would gradually decline and die as commercial traffic found alternative paths. Professional protection services emerged to address the bandit threat, but these came with their own risks and costs. Mercenary guards might be skilled fighters, but they were also expensive, unreliable, and sometimes in league with the very criminals they claimed to protect against. Some protection services were actually extortion rackets run by bandits themselves, who would create problems and then sell solutions to desperate travelers. The development of large merchant caravans was partly a response to bandit threats. Traveling in groups of 50 or 100 people, with professional guards and substantial defensive capabilities, offered some protection against criminal attack. But these caravans moved slowly, required enormous logistical coordination, and were themselves attractive targets for large, well-organized bandit armies. Even successful merchants who survived multiple encounters with bandits often found their profits consumed by security costs. The expense of guards, bribes, tribute payments, and losses to theft could eliminate any financial benefit from long-distance trade. Many would-be merchants were driven out of business not by market forces, but by criminal predation that made honest commerce impossible. The judicial systems of ancient times offered little recourse for bandit victims who survived attacks. Courts were distant, corrupt, or simply non-existent in many regions. Even when criminals were captured and tried, the stolen goods were rarely recovered, and the sentences were often laughably light compared to the suffering inflicted on victims. Justice was a luxury that few could afford, and fewer still could expect to receive. Some communities developed their own vigilante responses to bandit threats, organizing local militias to patrol trade routes and hunt down criminal groups. But these amateur forces were often outmatched by experienced bandits who had chosen violence as their profession. Vigilante expeditions sometimes succeeded in driving bandits from one area, only to push them into neighboring regions where they would prey on different victims. The religious and moral dimensions of banditry added another layer of complexity to an already nightmarish situation. Some criminal groups justified their actions through perverted interpretations of religious texts, claiming divine sanction for their violence against travelers of different faiths. Others operated under crude codes of honor that governed their internal relationships while showing no mercy to outsiders. The seasonal migration patterns of nomadic tribes sometimes brought additional security threats to established travel routes. Groups that survived through legitimate herding and trade during prosperous times might turn to banditry during periods of drought, disease, or political upheaval. The line between legitimate tribal activity and criminal predation was often blurred, making it difficult for travelers to distinguish between potential allies and deadly enemies. As our merchant approaches yet another narrow pass in the rocky hills ahead of him, he knows that every shadow could conceal armed men. Every bend in the path could be his last. The goods he carries represent months of work and investment, but they also mark him as a target worthy of violence. His donkey, his water, his food, even the clothes on his back could mean the difference between life and death for desperate criminals who have chosen to survive by preying on others. The bandits ahead have been watching the road since dawn, counting travelers and assessing targets. They've seen our merchant approaching for the last hour, noting his solitary state, his valuable cargo, and his obvious exhaustion from days of difficult travel. They've already decided that he won't leave this pass alive, and they're simply waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. But the story of ancient travel doesn't end with bandits and violence. Even those fortunate enough to avoid criminal predation faced challenges that would test the limits of human endurance and ingenuity. Because surviving the road was only half the battle, and the destinations that awaited weary travelers often presented their own unique forms of danger and discomfort. The narrow pass closes in around our merchant like the jaws of some ancient predator, and as he rounds the next bend, his worst fears materialize from the shadows. 3 men emerge from behind the rocks, not hurrying, not shouting, simply stepping into his path with the casual confidence of those who have done this many times before. Their weapons are crude but effective, iron blades that have tasted blood, wooden clubs worn smooth by countless hands, a bow with an arrow already nocked and aimed at his chest. But let's pause here, just before violence erupts, and consider what has brought these men to this moment. Because the bandits of biblical times weren't born monsters. They were created by the same brutal world that made travel so dangerous for everyone else. Many were former soldiers, discharged after campaigns with no pension, no land, and no skills beyond killing. Others were farmers displaced by drought, war, or the casual cruelty of landlords who decided their fields were needed for other purposes. Some were escaped slaves, men who had chosen the uncertain dangers of banditry over the certain misery of bondage. A few were the younger sons of poor families, sent away because there wasn't enough food to feed everyone through the winter. They had tried honest work, begging, even prostitution in some cases, but had found that violence paid better and more reliably than any legitimate trade. The leader of this particular group is a man named Jephthah, though our merchant will never learn his name. Jephthah was once a shepherd, tending flocks in the hills above Bethlehem, until a series of bad winters killed most of his animals and left him with debts he could never repay. His creditors took his remaining sheep, his small plot of land, even his shepherd's staff. His wife left him for a cousin who still had prospects. His children were sold to pay what remained of his debts. 3 years ago, Jephthah made his first kill on this very road, a spice merchant travelling alone, much like our current victim. The man had begged, offered to share his goods, even promised to put in a good word for Jephthah with potential employers in Jerusalem. Jephthah had listened politely, then crushed his skull with a rock. The merchant's death had bought Jephthah 2 months of decent food and enough silver to recruit his first accomplices. Now he runs a small but efficient criminal enterprise, specializing in solo travelers and small groups who can't afford professional protection. He's killed perhaps 30 people in the past 3 years, men and women whose only crime was trying to make a living in a world that offered few opportunities for honest success. He doesn't enjoy the killing, but he doesn't lose sleep over it either. In his mind, he's simply doing what's necessary to survive in a world that had shown him no mercy. The other 2 bandits have similar stories. Micah was a potter whose workshop was destroyed when rival tribes raided his village. Everyone he'd ever known was dead or scattered, his life's work reduced to broken shards in the ruins of his home. Nathan was a younger son who'd tried to make his way as a day labourer, competing with slaves for work that barely paid enough to buy bread. Both men had discovered that taking what they needed was easier than earning it through legitimate means. Our merchant recognises the situation immediately. He's heard the stories, seen the aftermath of bandit attacks, even helped bury the victims on one memorable occasion. He knows that pleading won't help, that offering to share his goods will only delay the inevitable, that running will simply make his death more painful. These men have moved beyond desperation into something colder and more professional. "Peace be with you, brothers," he says, using the traditional greeting that acknowledges shared humanity even in the face of mortal danger. It's a futile gesture, but one that marks him as a man who retains some dignity even in his final moments. Jephthah doesn't bother to return the greeting. Instead, he nods to his companions, who begin moving to flank the merchant and cut off any possible escape routes. The choreography is practiced, efficient, economical. They've done this so many times that words are unnecessary. The merchant's donkey, sensing danger, begins to bray and pull against its lead rope. The animal's distress adds an almost comic element to the scene, as if nature itself is protesting the casual brutality about to unfold. But there's nothing comic about the way Nathan's club comes down on the merchant's skull, or the way Micah's knife slides between his ribs, or the way Jephthah methodically begins stripping the body of anything valuable. The entire encounter takes less than 5 minutes. The merchant's goods are divided according to a system the bandits have developed over years of practice. Jephthah gets first choice as leader, then the others select in order of seniority. The donkey will be sold at the next market town, its ownership transferred through a network of corrupt dealers who ask no questions about provenance. The body is dragged off the path and left for the scavengers. Within days, wild animals will scatter the bones, and within weeks, even those traces will disappear. The merchant will simply vanish from history. One more casualty of a world where human life was cheap, and violence was often the most reliable path to survival. But this scene, horrific as it is, represents just one form of the human predation that made ancient travel so dangerous. Organised banditry was actually preferable to some alternatives, because at least bandits wanted to rob you quickly and move on to the next victim. Other forms of criminal enterprise were far more patient and systematic in their exploitation of travellers. Consider the false inn, a particularly cruel form of trap that preyed on travellers' desperate need for shelter and hospitality. From the outside, these establishments looked like legitimate wayhouses, complete with welcoming hosts, decent food, and comfortable sleeping arrangements. Weary travellers would arrive after days on the road, grateful to find what appeared to be a safe haven in dangerous territory. The proprietors would be friendly, solicitous, eager to hear news from distant places. They'd offer their best rooms, their finest food, entertainment, and companionship after long days of isolation on dangerous roads. Guests would go to sleep feeling safe and grateful. Perhaps for the first time in weeks, they would never wake up. The innkeepers would slit their throats in the night, or poison their wine, or simply club them to death in their sleep. The bodies would be buried in the inn's garden or fed to pigs that left no traces behind. The victims' possessions would be sold through the same networks that handled bandit loot, their animals added to the inn's legitimate livestock, their identities erased as completely as if they had never existed. Some false inns operated for decades, killing hundreds of travellers while maintaining facades of respectability. The proprietors would be pillars of their communities, known for their generosity and hospitality. They would host local festivals, contribute to religious ceremonies, even provide legitimate shelter to favoured guests who were too well connected to murder safely. The selection process was coldly practical. Solo travellers were preferred targets, especially those with valuable goods, and no one expecting their arrival at specific destinations. Merchants travelling established routes were ideal victims, as their disappearances could be explained by bandit attacks or accidents. Women travelling alone were particularly vulnerable, as their deaths were less likely to provoke serious investigations. The psychological profiles of false inn operators were often more complex than simple bandits. Many genuinely enjoyed the hospitality business and took pride in their cooking, their comfortable rooms, and their ability to make guests feel welcome. The murder was just another business transaction, separated in their minds from the legitimate services they provided to survivors. Some false inns developed elaborate systems for disposing of evidence and maintaining their cover stories. They would maintain correspondence with imaginary business partners in distant cities, creating paper trails that suggested their murdered guests had arrived safely at their destinations. They would plant evidence of bandit attacks along nearby roads, complete with torn clothing and scattered belongings that supported stories of robbery and murder. The most sophisticated operations involved entire communities in their criminal enterprises. Local officials would be bribed or threatened into ignoring suspicious disappearances. Merchants would be paid to provide alibis and false documentation. Even religious leaders might be corrupted into blessing enterprises they knew were built on systematic murder. The economic impact of false inns extended far beyond their immediate victims. Legitimate hospitality businesses suffered when travellers became suspicious of all roadside accommodations. Some regions developed reputations for danger that lasted generations, even after the criminal enterprises had been discovered and shut down. Trade routes would be abandoned entirely when too many merchants disappeared along particular paths. The discovery of false inns was often accidental, usually occurring when investigators looking for missing persons stumbled across burial grounds or other evidence of systematic murder. The trials that followed were typically brief and brutal, with entire communities sometimes being held responsible for crimes they had enabled through silence or complicity. But even travellers who avoided bandits and false inns faced another category of human predator that was perhaps even more dangerous because it operated within the boundaries of legitimate authority. Corrupt officials, tax collectors, and local rulers had discovered that travellers were ideal targets for legal extortion, as they were far from home, unfamiliar with local laws, and desperate to continue their journeys without delays that could prove fatal. The system worked with elegant simplicity. Officials would establish checkpoints along major travel routes, ostensibly to collect legitimate taxes or inspect goods for contraband. But the real purpose was to identify wealthy travellers and extract as much wealth as possible through a combination of legal fees, fines, and outright extortion. The charges were always creative and impossible to disprove. Travellers might be accused of carrying prohibited goods, failing to pay proper tribute to local deities, or violating obscure regulations that existed only in the officials' imaginations. The penalties were always severe enough to bankrupt victims, but just reasonable enough to seem legitimate to observers. Women travellers faced additional forms of official predation, as corrupt officials would demand sexual services in addition to financial payments. Refusal would result in imprisonment, confiscation of goods, or charges of prostitution that could result in stoning or other forms of execution. The victims had no recourse to higher authorities, as the corrupt officials were often the highest authorities in their regions. The most successful corrupt officials developed networks that spanned entire provinces, sharing information about wealthy travelers and coordinating their extortion efforts. A merchant who paid heavy tribute at one checkpoint might find himself facing even larger demands at the next, as officials communicated about his apparent wealth and willingness to pay. Some regions became so notorious for official corruption that they were avoided entirely by legitimate traders, despite offering the shortest routes between major commercial centres. Alternative paths would be developed through more difficult terrain, adding weeks to journey times and enormous costs to transportation, all to avoid officials who had turned law enforcement into a criminal enterprise. The line between official corruption and outright banditry was often blurred, as some corrupt officials would arrange for bandit attacks on travellers who refused to pay their extortionate demands. The attacks would be carried out by off-duty guards or local criminals working under official protection, creating a perfect system where victims could be robbed legally or illegally, depending on which approach seemed more profitable. Religious authorities were not immune to the temptation of preying on travellers, despite their sacred obligations to provide hospitality and protection to strangers. Some temples and monasteries developed their own forms of systematic exploitation, using religious law and spiritual authority to extract wealth from desperate travellers who had nowhere else to turn for help. The methods varied by region and religious tradition, but the results were consistent. Travellers seeking shelter at religious establishments would find themselves subjected to elaborate purification rituals that required expensive offerings. They would be told that their journeys had spiritually contaminated them, and that complex ceremonies were necessary to restore their ritual purity. The costs of these ceremonies would escalate dramatically once the religious authorities assessed the travellers' apparent wealth. What began as a simple request for shelter would become a financial nightmare that could consume months of earnings. Refusal to participate would result in accusations of blasphemy or spiritual contamination that could make the travellers unwelcome in any religious community along their route. Some religious establishments developed particularly cruel forms of spiritual extortion, claiming that the travellers' presence had polluted sacred spaces and that enormous payments were required to restore the site's holiness. The victims would find themselves trapped between their need for shelter and protection and demands for payment that could leave them destitute and stranded far from home. The most corrupt religious authorities would collaborate with secular officials and criminal organizations, sharing information about wealthy travellers and coordinating their exploitation efforts. A pilgrim who survived bandit attacks and official extortion might find themselves facing even larger demands from religious authorities who knew exactly how much wealth remained to be extracted. As our merchant's blood seeps into the dusty ground of that narrow mountain pass, his story becomes part of a larger pattern of systematic human predation that made ancient travel a form of voluntary martyrdom. But even death wasn't the end of a traveller's potential suffering, because the ancient world had developed forms of exploitation that could continue long after the victim's last breath. The slave markets of major cities were filled with people who had begun their ordeals as innocent travellers, kidnapped and sold by the same criminal networks that preyed on ancient roads. Children who survived bandit attacks that killed their parents would find themselves chained in slave markets, their identities erased and their futures reduced to lives of unpaid labour for masters who saw them as livestock rather than human beings. Women who survived attacks often faced fates worse than death, sold into sexual slavery, or forced marriages that were indistinguishable from rape. Their captors would forge documents claiming they were legitimate wives or servants, making legal rescue virtually impossible even when family members learned of their fate and tried to intervene. The psychological warfare employed by slavers was particularly cruel. as they would often keep family members alive as leverage to ensure cooperation from their victims. A mother might be told that her children would be killed if she tried to escape or attract attention to her situation. Children would be threatened with their parents' deaths if they refused to work or tried to run away. The international nature of the ancient slave trade meant that victims could be transported thousands of miles from their homes, sold and resold multiple times until even they lost track of their origins. Languages, customs, and religious practices would be systematically suppressed, making it impossible for slaves to maintain connections to their former lives or communicate with potential rescuers. Some slaves were worked to death in mines, quarries, or agricultural operations where human life was considered cheaper than animal labor. Others were used for entertainment in gladiatorial contests or other spectacles, where their deaths provided amusement for audiences who saw them as objects rather than people. The legal systems of most ancient societies provided no protection for slaves, who were considered property rather than persons. Even slaves who managed to prove their original free status would find themselves without recourse if their former owners could not be located, or if the documentation of their enslavement appeared legitimate to local authorities. The economic incentives for slavery were so strong that entire industries developed around the systematic exploitation of human beings. Professional slavers would operate along major trade routes, working with bandits, corrupt officials, and false innkeepers to maintain steady supplies of victims for urban markets. The profits were enormous, as a healthy adult slave could be worth several years' wages to the right buyer. Children were particularly valuable because they could be trained for specialized tasks and would provide decades of unpaid labor. Women of childbearing age commanded premium prices because they could produce additional slaves for their owners. The psychological damage inflicted on slave families was systematically calculated to break their will to resist. Children would be separated from parents and sold to buyers in distant regions. Husbands and wives would be deliberately split up to prevent them from supporting each other emotionally. Siblings would be scattered across multiple households to eliminate any remaining family bonds. Some slaves were forced to participate in the enslavement of others, creating psychological trauma that made escape or rebellion even more unlikely. Former travelers would be compelled to serve as guides for slaving expeditions, using their knowledge of routes and local conditions to help capture new victims. The religious dimensions of ancient slavery added another layer of cruelty to an already horrific system. Some societies believed that slavery was divinely ordained, that certain people were naturally suited to bondage and that freeing them would be contrary to the will of the gods. Slaves who tried to escape or rebel could be punished not just legally but spiritually, accused of defying divine order. The international scope of the slave trade meant that victims might find themselves in societies with completely different languages, religions, and customs. The cultural shock of displacement was often as traumatic as the physical abuse, as slaves struggled to understand their new environments while being punished for any signs of confusion or resistance. As we follow the fate of our murdered merchant's goods, now being divided among Jephthah and his accomplices, we see how the criminal networks of the ancient world operated with brutal efficiency. The donkey will be sold at a market 3 days' journey away, its markings altered, and its ownership history fabricated. The merchant's clothes will be bundled with other stolen goods and transported to a city where no one will recognize their original owner. The silver coins in the merchant's purse will be melted down and recast, their origins obscured beyond any possibility of identification. The trade goods he was carrying will be mixed with legitimate merchandise and sold through established commercial networks, their theft concealed by layers of apparently legal transactions. Within a week, every trace of the merchant's existence will have been absorbed into the criminal economy that paralleled and often intersected with legitimate commerce. His family will wait for his return, then send search parties, then gradually accept that he has joined the countless thousands who simply vanished on the roads of the ancient world. The bandits who killed him will use their profits to recruit new members, expand their territory, and increase the sophistication of their operations. They will invest in better weapons, more reliable intelligence networks, and stronger relationships with the corrupt officials who protect them from serious law enforcement efforts. And tomorrow, another traveller will approach the same narrow pass where our merchant met his end, driven by the same desperate economic needs that had motivated his killer's original victims. The cycle will continue, fed by a world where human life was cheap, violence was profitable, and the strong preyed on the weak with casual efficiency that would horrify modern observers. But even this catalogue of human predation doesn't capture the full horror of ancient travel, because we haven't yet discussed the diseases that stalked every road, the medical emergencies that could kill in hours, and the complete absence of any system for helping travellers who fell victim to illness, injury, or simple bad luck. The road ahead stretches on through landscapes that seem beautiful from a distance, but conceal dangers that would challenge even modern travellers equipped with all the advantages of contemporary medicine and communication. And our journey through this nightmare world of ancient travel is far from over. The crimson stain spreads slowly into the dust where our merchant's life has ended, but his story continues in ways that would horrify any modern traveller. Because you see, death on ancient roads was rarely swift or dignified, and the suffering didn't end when the heart stopped beating. The diseases that claimed more travellers than all the bandits combined were patient predators that could stalk their victims for days, weeks, or even months before delivering their final blow. Let's step back from that blood-soaked mountain pass and follow another traveller, a young woman named Miriam, who's making the journey from her village near the Sea of Galilee to visit her sister in Hebron. Unlike our unfortunate merchant, Miriam has managed to avoid the bandits and corrupt officials. She's even found reasonably honest hospitality along the way. But as she wakes on her 7th morning on the road, something is terribly wrong. It starts with a simple stomachache, the kind of minor discomfort that modern people might treat with an antacid tablet and forget within hours. But this is the ancient world, where there are no antacids, no understanding of bacteria, and no concept of food safety beyond basic common sense. The water Miriam drank yesterday from what appeared to be a clean spring was actually contaminated by animal waste from upstream. The bread she shared with fellow travellers was made from grain that had been stored improperly and infected with dangerous molds. By midday, the stomachache has become cramping so severe that she can barely walk. Her skin is hot with fever, her mouth dry despite drinking constantly from her water skin. She's developed the dreaded traveller's curse that ancient people knew all too well, the bloody flux that could drain the life from a healthy adult in a matter of days. Dysentery, though Miriam doesn't know its name, is beginning its systematic destruction of her intestinal tract. The bacteria are multiplying exponentially, producing toxins that will soon have her doubled over with pain, desperately seeking privacy for bodily functions that have become both urgent and uncontrollable. The dehydration that follows will be swift and merciless. In our modern world, Miriam would be rushed to a hospital, given intravenous fluids, treated with antibiotics, and monitored by medical professionals until the crisis passed. She'd be uncomfortable for a few days, but would recover completely with no lasting effects. But this is biblical times, where the concept of intravenous anything doesn't exist, where antibiotics won't be discovered for another 2,000 years, and where medical knowledge consists largely of folk remedies and desperate prayers. Miriam's travelling companions, a family of merchants heading to the same general region, face an impossible decision. They could stay with her, providing what comfort they can while she suffers through the illness. But this would mean losing precious travel time during the brief window of good weather they'd planned their journey around. It would mean sharing their limited water supplies with someone who might not survive anyway, and it would mean risking their own health by remaining in close contact with whatever disease was consuming their companion. Or they could abandon her, leaving her by the roadside with perhaps a day's water and a prayer that someone else would take pity on her condition. This wasn't cruelty in the modern sense. It was practical survival in a world where sentiment could get entire families killed. The merchants have children to feed, debts to pay, and their own lives to preserve. Staying with one dying woman could doom them all. The decision is made without much discussion. They leave Miriam propped against a tree beside the path, along with a small water skin and some dried fruit that she's already too sick to eat. They mumble prayers for her soul and promises to send help if they encounter any, but everyone knows these are empty gestures meant to ease their own consciences rather than provide real assistance. Miriam spends the next 2 days in a delirium of fever and pain, occasionally lucid enough to wave weakly at passing travellers who give her a wide berth. Ancient people understood that some illnesses were contagious, even if they didn't understand how contagion worked. A sick person by the roadside was assumed to be carrying something that could spread to others, making them untouchable, except to the most charitable souls. The physical progression of her illness follows a pattern that was tragically familiar to ancient peoples. The fever climbs higher each day, causing hallucinations and delirium. The dysentery becomes more frequent and more bloody, dehydrating her rapidly, while making it impossible for her body to retain the small amounts of water she manages to drink. Her skin becomes papery and loose, her eyes sunken, her breathing shallow and rapid. By the 3rd day, Miriam is no longer conscious most of the time. When awareness does flicker back, it brings only pain and the growing realization that she's going to die alone, far from family, with her body unburied and unmourned. This was perhaps the greatest terror for ancient peoples. Not death itself, but death away from home, without proper burial rites, with no one to speak their names or remember their lives. Her story ends not with dramatic final words or peaceful closure, but with the simple cessation of breath as her dehydrated body finally gives up its struggle. Within hours, scavengers begin their work. Within days, her bones will be scattered across the hillside. Within weeks, even those traces will disappear, leaving no evidence that Miriam ever existed, except for the grief of a sister in Hebron, who will spend months wondering why her visitor never arrived. But Miriam's fate, horrible as it is, represents just one form of the medical nightmares that claimed ancient travellers. Infectious diseases were democracy's cruelest joke in the ancient world, striking rich and poor, young and old, pious and sinful, with equal indifference. The very act of travel exposed people to new strains of familiar illnesses and entirely foreign diseases for which they had no immunity. Consider malaria, the ancient world's most patient killer. Unlike dysentery, which struck quickly and resolved one way or another within days, malaria was a stalker that could pursue its victims for years. The disease was endemic around water sources throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, carried by mosquitoes that ancient people saw as mere nuisances rather than vectors of death. A traveller might be bitten by an infected mosquito and feel perfectly fine for weeks. The parasites would be multiplying silently in the liver, building up strength for their assault on the red blood cells. Then, suddenly, the victim would be struck by fever so intense it felt like being burned alive from the inside. The chills that followed would be equally severe, leaving the sufferer shaking uncontrollably, despite being wrapped in every available covering. The cycle would repeat every few days. Fever, chills, sweating, exhaustion, then apparent recovery. Each episode would leave the victim weaker, more anemic, more vulnerable to other diseases. Ancient travellers learned to fear these recurring fevers, knowing they marked the beginning of a slow decline that could last months or years before finally claiming its victim. Typhoid fever presented its own unique horrors for ancient travellers. The disease often began with symptoms that seemed manageable: headache, fatigue, loss of appetite. But these mild beginnings masked a bacterial infection that was systematically destroying the victim's digestive system and spreading throughout their body. As typhoid progressed, victims developed the characteristic rose-coloured spots on their chest and abdomen. Their fever would climb to dangerous levels, causing delirium and confusion. The disease attacked the nervous system, causing some victims to become violent or completely unresponsive. Others would develop intestinal bleeding that could prove rapidly fatal. The truly cruel aspect of typhoid was that it could be carried by people who showed no symptoms themselves. A seemingly healthy innkeeper or fellow traveller could be spreading the disease to everyone they encountered, creating chains of infection that could devastate entire communities. Ancient peoples had no way to identify these carriers or protect themselves from invisible threats. Cholera was perhaps the most feared of all travellers' diseases because of the speed with which it could kill. A person could wake up feeling perfectly fine and be dead by sunset, their body drained of fluids by the massive diarrhea and vomiting that characterized the disease. The dehydration was so severe and rapid that victims would literally shrivel up, their skin becoming blue and wrinkled, their eyes sinking deep into their skulls. The psychological terror of cholera was as devastating as its physical effects. Families would watch helplessly as loved ones were transformed into unrecognizable husks within hours. Entire caravans could be wiped out in days, leaving only scattered bones and abandoned goods to mark their passage through cholera-infested regions. Water sources contaminated with cholera could kill hundreds of people before anyone realized the connection between the well and the deaths. Ancient peoples often attributed these outbreaks to divine wrath or poisoned air rather than contaminated water, making it nearly impossible to take effective preventive measures. But infectious diseases weren't the only medical threats that stalked ancient roads. Injuries that would be minor inconveniences today could become death sentences for travellers far from home, with no access to proper medical care. A simple cut could become infected and develop into blood poisoning that would kill within days. A sprained ankle could slow a traveller down enough to make them easy prey for bandits or wild animals. Broken bones presented particularly challenging dilemmas for ancient travellers. Without proper splinting materials or medical knowledge, a fractured leg or arm might heal crooked, leaving the victim permanently disabled. More seriously, compound fractures, where the bone broke through the skin, almost invariably became infected, leading to gangrene and death, unless the limb could be amputated quickly and cleanly. The tools available for ancient field medicine were crude, and often more dangerous than helpful. Knives used for surgery were the same ones used for cutting food or cleaning animals, with no understanding of sterilization. Bandages were torn from whatever fabric was available, often dirty and contaminated. Pain relief consisted of alcohol, if available, or herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. Childbirth on the road was a nightmare that claimed countless women and babies throughout the ancient world. Pregnant women who were forced to travel faced the constant risk of going into labour, far from any assistance. Without skilled midwives, sterile conditions, or medical intervention capabilities, both mother and child faced enormous risks during delivery. The physical trauma of giving birth while travelling was compounded by the complete lack of recovery time that new mothers required. A woman who delivered a baby on Monday might be expected to continue travelling on Tuesday, carrying her newborn while walking 20 miles over rough terrain. The infection risks were enormous, the physical stress overwhelming, and the infant mortality rates catastrophic. Mental health challenges added another layer of suffering to the already overwhelming burdens of ancient travel. The constant stress of facing life-threatening dangers day after day took a severe psychological toll on travellers. Many developed what we would now recognize as anxiety disorders, depression, or post-traumatic stress from their experiences on the road. The isolation of long-distance travel was particularly damaging to mental health. Humans are social creatures who require regular interaction with others for psychological well-being. Travellers might go weeks without meaningful conversation, companionship, or emotional support. The loneliness could become as debilitating as any physical illness. Sleep deprivation was chronic among ancient travelers who had to maintain constant vigilance against threats. The inability to rest properly for weeks or months at a time would cause hallucinations, impaired judgment, and emotional instability that made every other danger more severe. Travelers would begin making poor decisions, taking unnecessary risks, or simply giving up hope when exhaustion overwhelmed their survival instincts. The seasonal patterns of disease made travel planning even more complex and dangerous. Summer brought heat-related illnesses, water contamination, and insect-borne diseases. Winter meant exposure, hypothermia, and respiratory infections that could quickly become fatal in travelers weakened by cold and malnutrition. Plague outbreaks could make entire regions impassable overnight. These weren't just inconveniences that might delay travel plans. They were death sentences for anyone caught in affected areas. Ancient peoples had no understanding of quarantine procedures or disease prevention, so plague could spread with terrifying speed through populations that had no immunity or protection. The economic impact of disease on ancient travel was enormous. Sick travelers consumed supplies without making progress toward their destinations. They required care and assistance from traveling companions, slowing entire groups. They often had to abandon valuable cargo when they became too weak to carry it, representing total financial loss for merchants and traders. Some diseases left survivors permanently disabled, unable to continue their journeys or return home. These stranded individuals became beggars, dependent on charity for survival. Others were abandoned by traveling companions who couldn't afford to care for them, left to die alone in foreign lands far from family and friends. The lack of medical knowledge meant that ancient peoples often made their health problems worse through well-intentioned but harmful treatments. Bloodletting was commonly used for fevers, further weakening patients who were already struggling with dehydration and illness. Herbal remedies were often toxic, causing additional symptoms that compounded the original problems. Religious beliefs sometimes interfered with practical medical care, as diseases were often attributed to divine punishment for moral failings. Sick travelers might be ostracized by their companions, seen as carrying spiritual contamination that could spread to others. This social isolation made recovery even less likely and psychological suffering more severe. The complete absence of emergency medical services meant that accidents and sudden illnesses were often immediately fatal. A heart attack, stroke, or severe allergic reaction that might be survivable with modern medical intervention would mean certain death for an ancient traveler. There were no ambulances to call, no emergency rooms to rush to, no trained paramedics to provide life-saving treatment. Even minor injuries could have cascading effects that ultimately proved fatal. A small cut on the foot could become infected, leading to blood poisoning. A bee sting could trigger a severe allergic reaction in someone who had never been stung before. A fall from a donkey could cause internal injuries that would slowly kill the victim over days or weeks. The psychological impact of watching traveling companions die from disease or injury was severe and cumulative. Survivors would be traumatized by the suffering they witnessed, haunted by the knowledge that they too could succumb at any moment. The constant presence of death made every day a struggle, not just for physical survival, but for mental and emotional stability. Women faced additional medical challenges related to their reproductive health. Menstruation while traveling was not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous, as the blood could attract predators, and the physical discomfort could slow down entire groups. Pregnancy complications, miscarriages, and other gynecological problems had no effective treatments and often proved fatal. Children were particularly vulnerable to the medical challenges of ancient travel. Their immune systems were less developed, making them more susceptible to infectious diseases. They required more food and water relative to their body weight, straining limited supplies. They were more vulnerable to temperature extremes and less able to communicate their symptoms when illness struck. The elderly faced their own unique medical challenges on ancient roads. age-related conditions like arthritis, heart problems, and declining eyesight made travel more difficult and dangerous. Older travelers were more likely to fall, more vulnerable to temperature extremes, and less able to recover from illness or injury. Dental problems were a constant source of pain and potential infection for ancient travelers. Without proper dental care, tooth decay and gum disease were universal problems that could become life-threatening if infections spread to other parts of the body. A simple toothache could develop into a facial abscess that would kill its victim within days. The cumulative effect of all these medical challenges was that most ancient travelers arrived at their destinations in worse health than when they started their journeys. The physical and psychological toll of the road-aged people rapidly, leaving permanent damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives. As we follow Miriam's story to its tragic conclusion beside that dusty roadside, we're reminded that her death represents just one thread in a vast tapestry of medical suffering that defined ancient travel. For every dramatic story of bandit attacks or wild animal encounters, there were dozens of quiet deaths from disease, injury, and medical neglect that claimed travelers far from home and family. The road ahead stretches on through landscapes that may appear peaceful from a distance, but conceal medical dangers that would challenge even modern travelers equipped with all the advantages of contemporary medicine. And our journey through the nightmare world of ancient travel continues, because we haven't yet explored the destinations themselves and the unique horrors that awaited weary travelers who somehow managed to survive the perils of the road. The ancient cities that beckoned to weary travelers like beacons of hope and civilization often proved to be mirages of safety that dissolved into new forms of nightmare upon closer inspection. You see, arriving at your destination in biblical times didn't mean your troubles were over. It meant they were just beginning to take on different, often more insidious forms. Picture our surviving travelers, those fortunate enough to have avoided bandits, disease, and the countless other perils of the ancient roads, finally cresting the hill that reveals their destination spread out below them. The walls look solid and reassuring. Smoke rises from countless hearths suggesting warmth and food, and the sounds of human activity promise safety and civilization after days or weeks of isolation and danger. But what awaited them inside those walls was often worse than anything they'd encountered on the road. Ancient cities were breeding grounds for disease on a scale that would horrify modern health officials. Thousands of people crammed together within defensive walls, with no understanding of sanitation, no sewage systems worth the name, and water supplies that were often more contaminated than the streams travelers had avoided in the wilderness. The very concentration of humanity that made cities centers of trade and culture also made them death traps for the unwary. The streets themselves were rivers of filth. Human waste was dumped from windows into alleyways where it mixed with animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and the industrial byproducts of various crafts and trades. The smell alone could knock a newcomer unconscious, but locals had long since lost their sense of smell to the constant assault of putrid odours that defined urban life. Water was perhaps the most dangerous necessity in ancient cities. Public wells and fountains, when they existed, were contaminated by sewage, industrial waste, and the bodies of animals and sometimes humans that had fallen or been dumped into them. Private wells were jealously guarded by their owners, and often just as polluted as public sources. Many travellers who survived the journey to their destinations died within days of arrival from drinking water that was literally poisonous. The concentration of people in ancient cities created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases to spread like wildfire. Plague, cholera, typhoid, and countless other infectious diseases could race through urban populations in a matter of days, killing thousands before anyone understood what was happening. A traveller arriving during the early stages of an epidemic might find themselves trapped in a city of the dying, with no way to escape before the disease claimed them too. Food safety was another nightmare entirely. Without refrigeration or effective preservation methods, Food spoiled quickly in the heat and humidity of crowded cities. Merchants would try to disguise spoiled meat with spices, sell moldy bread to desperate customers, and pass off contaminated milk as fresh. The sick, the desperate, and the starving would eat anything available, often poisoning themselves in the process. Market areas were particularly hazardous, as vendors competed for customers by offering the cheapest possible goods, regardless of quality or safety. Meat might be days old and crawling with maggots, but it would be sold to anyone willing to pay. Fruits and vegetables were often picked before ripening and artificially coloured to appear fresh. Wine and beer were watered down with whatever liquid was handy, including water that was known to be contaminated. The legal systems of ancient cities offered little protection to travellers who found themselves victims of fraud, theft, or violence. Local courts were often corrupt, staffed by officials who could be bought by the highest bidder or who favoured local citizens over foreign visitors. A merchant who had his goods stolen might find that the thief was the judge's cousin, making legal recourse impossible. Language barriers made every transaction a potential trap. Travellers who couldn't speak the local dialect fluently were easy marks for con artists, fraudulent merchants, and corrupt officials who would deliberately mislead them about prices, laws, and customs. A simple misunderstanding could escalate into accusations of cheating, blasphemy, or espionage that could result in imprisonment or execution. Cultural differences created their own minefields of potential disaster. Religious practices that were acceptable in a traveller's homeland might be considered heretical or offensive in their destination city. Clothing styles, eating habits, even the way someone walked or spoke could mark them as foreign and therefore suspicious. In times of political tension, being identified as an outsider could be a death sentence. Accommodation in ancient cities was a nightmare that made the dangers of roadside camping seem appealing by comparison. Most cities had no equivalent of modern hotels or inns. Travellers were expected to rely on the hospitality of relatives, business associates, or religious institutions. Those without such connections might find themselves sleeping in the streets, vulnerable to robbery, assault, and exposure to the elements. When commercial accommodations did exist, they were often little more than flop houses, where desperate people were crammed together in conditions that would be considered inhumane, even by ancient standards. Privacy was non-existent, theft was constant, and disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Many travellers found that their fellow lodgers were criminals, prostitutes, or people with contagious diseases that could prove fatal. The proprietors of these establishments were often criminals themselves, working with local thieves and corrupt officials to exploit their vulnerable guests. Travellers might check in with their possessions and wake up to find everything stolen, including their clothes. Complaints to local authorities would be ignored or met with demands for bribes that the victims could no longer afford to pay. Women travellers faced additional horrors in ancient cities, where they were seen as either property to be protected by male relatives or fair game for anyone strong enough to take them. A woman travelling alone would be assumed to be a prostitute, making her a target for violence, exploitation, and official harassment. Even women travelling with male companions might find themselves propositioned, assaulted, or kidnapped by local men who saw foreign women as exotic prizes to be won or taken by force. Children were equally vulnerable to urban predators who specialized in kidnapping young people for sale into slavery. Ancient cities were full of criminal networks that trafficked in human beings, and foreign children with no local family connections were ideal victims. Parents who arrived in cities with their children might find their families torn apart within hours by kidnappers who knew the local authorities could be bribed to look the other way. The industrial activities of ancient cities created their own unique hazards for visitors. Metalworking, pottery, dyeing, and other crafts produced toxic fumes that could poison anyone who stayed in the area too long. The waste products from these industries were often dumped into water supplies or simply left to accumulate in residential areas, creating environmental health hazards that would be unthinkable today. Noise pollution was another constant assault on travelers accustomed to the relative quiet of rural areas. Ancient cities were incredibly loud places, with the sounds of hammering, shouting, animals and machinery creating a constant cacophony that made sleep difficult and communication challenging. The psychological stress of constant noise, combined with all the other urban hazards, could drive visitors to the edge of madness. Fire was a perpetual threat in cities where wooden buildings were packed closely together and open flames were used for cooking, heating, and lighting. A single carelessly tended fire could destroy entire neighborhoods within hours, trapping residents and visitors in blazing infernos with no effective firefighting services to provide rescue. Many travelers who survived the dangers of the road died in urban fires that claimed thousands of lives in minutes. Crime in ancient cities was both more organized and more brutal than the random banditry of rural areas. Urban criminal networks operated with sophisticated intelligence systems, identifying wealthy targets and coordinating elaborate schemes to separate them from their possessions. Pickpockets, con artists, and thieves worked together in gangs that could strip a traveler of everything valuable within minutes of their arrival. Murder was often more profitable than simple robbery, as dead victims couldn't identify their attackers or seek revenge. Many travelers simply disappeared in ancient cities, their bodies disposed of in ways that left no traces for investigators to follow. The authorities, when they bothered to investigate at all, would usually conclude that the missing persons had left the city voluntarily or had fallen victim to accidents. Prostitution was legal and common in most ancient cities, but it was often controlled by criminal organizations that used violence and coercion to maintain their operations. Travelers seeking companionship might find themselves robbed, assaulted, or infected with diseases that would kill them slowly and painfully. The connection between prostitution and crime meant that entire districts of cities were essentially lawless zones, where violence was the primary method of conflict resolution. Gambling was another trap that ensnared unwary travelers who thought they could supplement their funds or pass time in urban entertainment districts. The games were invariably rigged, the operators were usually criminals, and losing players who couldn't pay their debts might find themselves enslaved, mutilated, or killed as examples to others. Even winning could be dangerous, as successful gamblers would be marked as targets for robbery or worse. Religious tensions in ancient cities could erupt into violence with little warning, trapping travelers in conflicts they didn't understand and couldn't escape. Sectarian riots, religious festivals that turned violent, and persecution of minority faiths could transform peaceful cities into battlegrounds overnight. Foreign visitors might find themselves attacked simply for being in the wrong place when religious violence erupted. Political instability was another constant threat in ancient cities, where coups, revolts, and power struggles could change the ruling authority without warning. Travelers who had obtained legitimate permits and protection from one regime might find themselves branded as enemies by the next. Political refugees, suspected spies, and anyone associated with the previous government could face imprisonment, torture, or execution. The economic systems of ancient cities were designed to extract maximum profit from every transaction, often at the expense of fairness or honesty. Travelers unfamiliar with local customs and prices were routinely overcharged for basic necessities. Money changers used fraudulent scales and counterfeit coins to cheat foreign visitors. Merchants would form cartels to fix prices at artificially high levels, knowing that travelers had no alternatives. Taxation in ancient cities was often arbitrary and confiscatory, with officials inventing new fees and levies whenever they encountered travelers who appeared to have money. Entry taxes, exit taxes, trade taxes, and religious taxes could consume a traveler's entire funds before they had accomplished any of their business objectives. Refusal to pay could result in imprisonment, confiscation of goods, or worse. Medical care in ancient cities was often more dangerous than no treatment at all. Urban physicians and healers were frequently charlatans who used their supposed expertise to exploit sick and desperate patients. Treatments that were supposed to cure diseases often made them worse or introduced new health problems. Surgery was performed with dirty instruments in unsanitary conditions, making infection and death more likely than recovery. The disposal of waste and dead bodies in ancient cities created constant health hazards that affected everyone living within the walls. Cemeteries were often located within city limits, and bodies were frequently buried in shallow graves that allowed diseases to spread through water supplies. During epidemics, bodies might be left unburied for days or weeks, creating breeding grounds for rats, insects, and disease organisms. Air quality in ancient cities was often worse than in the most polluted modern industrial areas. Smoke from countless fires, dust from construction and manufacturing, and the constant presence of animal waste created atmospheric conditions that would be considered toxic by today's standards. Respiratory diseases were endemic, and visitors from cleaner rural areas often developed severe breathing problems within days of arrival. The social hierarchies of ancient cities were rigid and unforgiving, with newcomers automatically assigned to the lowest rungs of society, regardless of their actual status or wealth. Travelers might find themselves treated as slaves or criminals simply because they were unfamiliar with local customs and couldn't demonstrate their legitimate social standing. Social mobility was virtually impossible for outsiders, who were viewed with suspicion and hostility by established residents. Educational and cultural institutions in ancient cities were often closed to outsiders or available only at prices that most travelers couldn't afford. Libraries, schools, and religious centers that might have provided information, assistance, or sanctuary to visitors were typically restricted to local citizens or members of specific social classes. Foreign travelers were seen as potential threats to local knowledge and customs, rather than as people who might contribute to the community. The psychological impact of urban life on travelers accustomed to rural or nomadic lifestyles was severe and often permanent. The constant noise, crowding, pollution, and social stress could trigger mental breakdowns that left visitors unable to function or care for themselves. Many travelers who entered ancient cities as healthy, functional individuals left as broken people who never fully recovered from their urban experiences. Transportation within ancient cities was often as dangerous as travel between them. Streets were narrow, crowded, and poorly maintained, making accidents common and often fatal. Cart traffic, pack animals, and crowds of pedestrians created chaos that could crush unwary visitors or trap them in stampedes. Getting lost in the maze-like streets of an unfamiliar city could be a death sentence, as there were no maps, street signs, or helpful information services for confused travelers. Storage and security for travelers' possessions were major challenges in ancient cities where theft was constant and storage facilities were primitive or non-existent. Travelers might be forced to carry all their valuables with them at all times, making them obvious targets for criminals. Alternatively, they might entrust their goods to local merchants or innkeepers who would steal everything and disappear, leaving the travelers stranded and destitute. Communication with the outside world was difficult or impossible for travelers in ancient cities. There were no postal services, telegraph systems, or reliable methods for sending messages to distant locations. Families and business associates had no way of knowing if travelers had arrived safely, completed their missions, or encountered problems that required assistance. This isolation made travelers even more vulnerable to exploitation and violence. The legal status of foreigners in ancient cities was often ambiguous or deliberately discriminatory, leaving travelers without recourse when they became victims of crime or fraud. They might not be permitted to testify in court, own property, or enter into binding contracts. Their word would not be believed against that of local citizens, and they would have no legal protections if they were accused of crimes or civil violations. Weather-related hazards were often worse in ancient cities than in rural areas. as the concentration of buildings and activities created urban heat islands that made hot weather more dangerous and trapped cold air that made winter conditions more severe. Flash floods could turn city streets into torrents that swept away everything in their path, while high winds could topple poorly constructed buildings onto crowded streets below. As our surviving travelers finally pass through the gates of their destination city, they might briefly feel relief at having completed their journey. But that relief would quickly turn to new forms of anxiety as they confronted the reality that urban survival required different skills than rural or road travel, and that the dangers they thought they had left behind were nothing compared to what awaited them in the crowded, diseased, violent maze of the ancient city. The walls that had seemed so welcoming from a distance now revealed themselves as the boundaries of a new kind of prison, where escape might prove even more difficult than arrival had been, and where the very goal of their dangerous journey might prove to be the most dangerous destination of all. And yet, despite all these overwhelming horrors we've explored together tonight, the most remarkable truth about ancient travel remains this: people continued to journey. They left their villages, their families, their familiar streets, despite knowing full well that they might never return. They packed their meager possessions, said their prayers, and stepped onto those deadly roads with a courage that should humble every modern traveler who complains about flight delays or uncomfortable hotel beds. What drove them to such desperate measures? Love, commerce, faith, and the irrepressible human need to connect across impossible distances. Merchants risked everything to trade in distant markets because their family's survival depended on it. Pilgrims endured unthinkable hardships to reach sacred sites that promised spiritual salvation. Families torn apart by war, famine, or economic necessity walked hundreds of miles through bandit territory just for the chance to embrace loved ones. One more time, consider the sheer determination required to plan such journeys. Every step had to be calculated months in advance. Which routes offered the best balance of safety and speed? When would the weather be most favorable? Could they find traveling companions for protection? Or would they have to brave the roads alone? How much food and water could they carry without becoming too burdened to defend themselves? Which officials might need bribing? Which tribal territories required special permissions or tribute? The mental preparation was perhaps even more challenging than the physical planning. Ancient travelers had to steel themselves psychologically for experiences that would break most modern people. They said goodbye to children knowing they might become orphans. They kissed spouses farewell, understanding these might be final embraces. They looked upon their homes with the knowledge that they might never see those familiar walls again. And yet they went, driven by necessity, pulled by hope, sustained by a faith in human resilience that seems almost miraculous from our comfortable modern perspective. The widow who walked 300 miles to reach her sister's house after her husband died. The young man who crossed deserts and mountains to study with a famous teacher. The mother who carried her sick child to a distant healer, knowing the journey itself might kill them both, but believing that staying home certainly would. These anonymous heroes of the ancient world developed survival strategies that would impress modern special forces soldiers. They learned to read the sky for weather signs, to identify safe water sources, to recognize the subtle indicators that marked bandit territory. They mastered the delicate art of negotiating with corrupt officials, the complex etiquette of requesting hospitality from strangers, the crucial skill of appearing valuable enough to help but not wealthy enough to rob. They created informal networks of mutual support that spanned continents. Merchants would leave supplies cached along regular routes for other travelers to use in emergencies. Religious communities established hostels and way stations that offered sanctuary to pilgrims of all faiths. Families scattered by circumstance maintained connections across vast distances, passing news and assistance through chains of trusted messengers who risked their lives to keep human bonds intact. The stories they told around campfires weren't the sanitized adventures of modern fiction, but hard-won wisdom passed down through generations of survivors. Which paths to avoid during certain seasons. How to recognize the signs of disease before it became contagious. What gifts might appease hostile tribes. How to hide valuables from bandits. When to run and when to fight. These weren't entertaining tales, but life-saving intelligence shared by people who understood that knowledge was the difference between returning home and disappearing forever. Their courage wasn't the heroic bravery of legends, but the quiet determination of ordinary people doing what needed to be done. The farmer who walked to the city to buy seed grain after his crops failed. The craftsman who traveled to distant markets to sell his goods. The messenger who carried news between separated communities. They didn't seek glory or adventure, they simply refused to let impossible circumstances defeat them. The physical conditioning required for ancient travel would challenge modern athletes. Walking 20 or 30 miles a day while carrying heavy packs, sleeping on hard ground, eating inadequate food, and maintaining constant alertness for threats. Their bodies adapted to hardships that would hospitalize contemporary people. Their feet became leather tough from walking on rocky paths. Their backs grew strong from carrying everything they owned. Their eyes learned to see danger in shadows and safety in subtle signs that modern people would never notice. But perhaps most remarkably, they maintained their humanity throughout these ordeals. They shared their meager supplies with fellow travelers. They cared for sick companions, even when it meant risking their own health. They showed kindness to strangers, despite knowing that trust could be fatal. They told jokes around evening fires, sang songs to pass the difficult miles, and found moments of beauty and joy even in the midst of constant danger. The letters and documents that survive from this period reveal people who are remarkably similar to us in their hopes, fears, and dreams. They worried about their children, missed their families, complained about the weather, and celebrated small victories with the same emotions we experience today. The only difference was the scale of their challenges and the magnitude of their courage in facing them. As we drift off to sleep tonight in our safe, warm beds, perhaps we can spare a thought for those ancient travelers whose stories we've shared. They faced monsters we can barely imagine with resources we would consider impossibly inadequate. Yet they persevered with a grace and determination that speaks to the very best of human nature. Their legacy lives on in every journey we take, every connection we maintain across distance, every act of courage we perform in the face of uncertainty. They proved that no obstacle is truly insurmountable, no distance too great to cross, no hardship so severe that it can completely extinguish the human spirit. So rest now, knowing that your own travels, however challenging they might seem, are blessed by centuries of human ingenuity and protected by systems those ancient wanderers could only dream of. Let their courage inspire your own journeys, their wisdom guide your steps, and their stories remind you that we are all travelers on roads that stretch far beyond what we can see. The paths they walked with such difficulty have become the highways we travel with ease. The cities they entered in terror have become destinations we reach in comfort. The distances that took them months to cross we cover in hours, but the human heart that drove them forward, the love that sustained them through suffering, and the hope that carried them home, these remain unchanged across the millennia. Sleep well, dear traveller. The road ahead is gentler than you know, and you carry within yourself the same indomitable spirit that has guided wayfarers since the dawn of human wandering. Sweet dreams, and may your own journeys, whatever they may be blessed with safety, purpose, and the joy of arriving home.